Good morning, Warsaw. Today is Monday, 25th September. It will be mostly cloudy and raining with highs of 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 6:43 a.m. and sunset at 6:44 p.m. We are on the 56th day of the Warsaw Uprising, and I hear that one of Roger's favorite insurgents is killed on this day.
Yes, you're right, Philippe, but Claire will tell us a little bit about who this person is and what happens to them. But I'm going to start very, very briefly on the situation on the ground today. So, just to recap, we have lost Wola, the old town, Powiśle, Czerniaków, Sadyba, and now it's all concentrated onto Mokotów, the Mokotów district in the south. So at dawn, the enemy continues their attack, and they're attacking from the southern part of the city and the western part of the city, and they're trying to hold their positions until the evening. There are fierce fights that last the whole day. The Germans are cutting into the Polish defences. They're forming a circle literally around them. There are hand-to-hand fights. They're in close quarters, and it's very interesting because buildings and places of defence are changing constantly hand-to-hand. So at one stage, one of the school buildings changes 7 times from Poles to the Germans. These troops are exhausted. They are starving. They haven't got the weaponry. They haven't got the manpower to be able to defeat the Germans. They're decimated. They've had enough. They just can't do it anymore. You've got German tanks that are reaching some of the major streets and they're breaking through the defence lines. It is becoming incredibly difficult, and one of the battalions suffer serious losses, really heavy losses. Many are killed and wounded as well. The Germans are trying to cut off the units that are defending the southern part of Mokotów. And what also happens on this day is that the German command send a few Home Army prisoners of war that have been taken, ones they haven't shot, a couple of officers as mediators to the commander of the Mokotów district, and they propose to him that he surrenders, and basically he says no. He sends them away. The talks are cut off, but it's on this night that he makes a decision, and we're going to talk about this decision over the next couple of days. He makes a decision to evacuate the troops through Mokotów to Szczurmiesz, to the Midtown district. And talking about the commander, his name is Rokicki, and he sends a dispatch. I just want to add this a little bit in. He sends a dispatch the day before the 24th of September to Antoni Chruściel, to the commander of the Warsaw Uprising. And he basically tells him he's been wounded, and I quote, "I will defend myself on the ruins." So he is going to hold as much as he can, even though he's been wounded. But he does make this decision on this day where they have a lack of food, they're extremely exhausted, and he's got 2 choices basically. Or he can evacuate the soldiers and continue the fight, and he chooses the latter. So we will hear about this in the next coming days. But let's come back to Roger's favourite insurgent, Claire. Who is Roger's favourite insurgent, and what happens to him on this day?
So you're talking about Eugeniusz Lokajski, the famous photographer, former sportsman, whose pseudonym was Brock, rather easier to pronounce, I must say, who was killed on this day. Lokajski was an athlete, and he was really a minor celebrity in Poland before the war. He had set the Polish record in javelin throwing, which he held on for 17 years. And he was one of the Poles who took part in the infamous 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin. Even though he'd had a serious shoulder injury just before, he was still placed 7th. So he was a bit of a hero in Poland. But he's now better known probably as being an absolutely brilliant photographer. And he's quite well known as well because there's quite a few photographs of him, including some before the uprising, where he's got the classic brill-creamed hair of a 1930s film star, lovely angular jawbones. And then, but also during the uprising as well, there's some photographs. There's one of him leaning against the rail of a ruined building. And he's got such style. It's really like a film star. We were talking about him a bit earlier. Alina, you'll put a photograph up on socials, won't you, of him?
Yes, Eugeniusz Lokajski is actually used as the main graphic for the day. So if you look at the graphic, that is a photograph of Eugeniusz Lokajski.
But yes, I think Roger's got a bit of a man crush on him as well. So yeah, in many ways, a notable figure. With the war, he had, of course, served, and the invasion of Poland had stopped his return to sports after his injury. And instead, he picked up a gun and served in the defence of Poland at the start of the war. And he actually commanded a platoon from the 35th Infantry Regiment and eventually was captured by the Soviets near Brest. But rather fantastically, he was one of the very few that managed to escape from his transport east in October 1939, which meant, of course, that he was spared the fate of so many of his comrades who were murdered by the Soviets at Katyn. Now, because he was already such a well-known figure, he's an important cultural figure, he knew that there would be a bit of a target on his back. So he tried to keep low during the early years of the resistance. He certainly didn't want to be captured by the Germans and be paraded as some sort of propaganda gain that they got this cultural figure. So he did his service, but largely he hid anonymously and worked as a labourer. But in 1942, he opened a photography shop in his mother's apartment in Warsaw. And he also secretly taught. As we know, schools were closed during the occupation. And a lot of former teachers and university students would teach their students. They carry on teaching them in secret in their apartments. And there was a whole underground structure that included high schools and a university. So he was part of that educational resistance movement as well. But his brother was killed in January 1944, and at this point, he was determined to take a more active armed role in the resistance, and he joined up as sworn-in member of the Home Army. So because of his past experience working in photography, during the Warsaw Uprising, he was actually given a captured German camera by his commander and was one of those that was told to document the uprising. And they couldn't have picked a better man for the job because his photographs are so poignant. A lot of them are real classics, but we often forget the people who took these images in the past. So it's nice to recognise him today. He took photographs both of the fallen insurgents, but also of ordinary civilians at everyday life during the uprising. But he also filmed notable moments in the battles, like he filmed the capture of the Pass building, which is that telephone exchange, that massive skyscraper, one of the tallest buildings in Europe. And that was part of the film footage that was edited together and was shown actually during the uprising in the Palladium cinema. We talked about that against the backdrop of the battle behind. But it was also smuggled out on those microfilms and sent west and has been part of the historic narrative that we recognise so well of the battle. But he wasn't just a photographer. Lokajski also fought on the front line, and he was part of the unit that was trying to break through to Śródmieścia in the defence of the post office on this day. As surrender loomed, he was tasked with another role, which was taking photographs of the insurgents so that they could be put into forged Ken cards. So these are the false identity papers that would then be sort of rubbed and sullied as if they were old from use and pocketed and used so the insurgents could try to get out of the city hidden among the civilian population who are now being evacuated in small pockets. But he didn't have enough material for this life-saving work. He needed more film plates. He knew that there was none in the local photography shop that he'd been using. So he went further afield and started scavenging. And seconds after entering another photography shop, a series of bombs directly hit the building he was in, which collapsed right into the basement. There was so much heavy rubble, the rescuers couldn't even get in to remove that, and his body would remain there and frayed until May 1945. When his body was recovered, he was actually found at the shop counter with his hands on his head as if protecting himself from the coming impact. It's very poignant. It's sort of like a last photograph that was never taken, really. At least I guess his end was very fast. He was buried that June. He's one of those that does actually have a named grave so people can pay their respects to him. And his burial was attended by a massive crowd of people. But of course, I mean, that's not his legacy. His legacy isn't actually his gravesite. It's his work. And before he died, he'd actually given his sister, Zofia, a box absolutely filled with all of his negatives that he had taken until that point through the war and through the uprising. And they were donated to the Warsaw Uprising Museum. And if anyone goes to Warsaw, I'd hugely recommend going to that museum. They have, some corridors made out like the old streets, and then they have whole walls with this film projected onto it. So you can see a lot of his work there, and also a number of the stills throughout that museum, highlighting different aspects of the uprising. So a really important documenter of the Warsaw Uprising who lost his life on this day.
Yeah, it's one of those aspects of the Warsaw Rising which we should know the story of the Rising itself better outside of Poland. I mean, that's a given. But this aspect of the photography taken during the Rising, I think it speaks to how sort of comparatively sophisticated, advanced, if it doesn't sound too sort of patronizing to say that, how sort of sophisticated the Poles were in that sense. People like Lokajski, and there was another photographer who his name was Chris Brown. It doesn't sound very terribly Polish, but they produced I think some of the best photography of World War II. Bearing in mind that proper what we would now call photojournalism is kind of in its infancy at this point. So it's only the sort of late 1920s, if you like, that photography had developed away from the sort of the box camera on a tripod, that you actually had a camera you could hang around your neck and was actually, you could actually do this sort of thing. So it's really, quite a novel thing. And you look at what Chris Brown was doing and what Lokajski was doing, it's very much equivalent to, Robert Capa, who goes in with American troops on D-Day, for example. Some of those iconic images that we have of D-Day that come from Capa's camera, you can say the same with Lokajski and Chris Brown in Warsaw. And actually, another example is, it doesn't very often get mentioned because he's on the wrong side. It's Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's photographer. Yeah, I mean, he, again, an absolutely brilliant photographer. And if you search online for Hitler photos now, which I'm sure we've all been there, most of those that you see are Hoffmann pictures. I mean, and they're astonishingly good.
It's the classic one of when he was first arrested and put in jail and then released, that day photograph, which of Hitler coming out of the jail with that arch behind him. But of course, it was totally stage set. It's further on down the road, So this is the power of photography. People are learning it. Hoffmann obviously knew it, and his photographs are absolute, very well known. And I do think that Lokajski's pictures should be as well known. They're certainly as moving. So, yeah.
And that's not just my man crush speaking. I mean, he genuinely is. He generally is, really, really talented photographer. So it's a sad day that he died today.
I just want to add one more thing to this, because some of these photographers, I mean, most of them who did survive, they actually continued their photography after the Warsaw Uprising. They took phenomenal photographs of, for example, the communist period, even the transformation period. So in the early 90s, when I came to Poland for the first time in 1993 and 1994, I went to this fabulous exhibition on Chris Brown, actually, funny enough, who took photographs all the way from the Warsaw Uprising through the communist period and in the transformation period, and it was amazing to be able to see his photography through his eyes. I think we take photography for granted, especially during the Warsaw Uprising, because there are some absolutely phenomenal photographs. They're not necessarily out on the internet, they're buried in the archives, and I think we should start publishing more of them.
Yeah, because you mentioned the Solidarity period, and later on there was a great series of photographs from martial law and from Solidarity. Is it Chris Niedenthal? I think he was an Anglo-Pole who went over and again, some absolutely fantastic piece of photojournalism from later on. Again, needs to be better known.
Totally agree with you. He is a fabulous, absolutely fabulous photographer. He has a website. If anybody's actually interested, he has a website, chrisniedenthal.com, and you can see some of his photographs there. If you're not going to go on there, I'm just going to give you a quick update. So he's got photographs of when Margaret Thatcher came to Gdańsk, when the West Chancellor Helmut Schmidt was in Auschwitz and he laid flowers. Cardinal Wyszynski, well, we talked about him when he was just a priest, but Cardinal Wyszynski's funeral, for example, the shipyard strikes of the Lenin shipyard in Gdańsk, Solidarity movement, Lech Wałęsa, private photos of Lech Wałęsa. He takes so many photographs of Solidarity stuff. He also took photographs of John Paul II when he visited Poland as a pope, obviously. And I think one of my favourite photographs has to be of a meat shop. I think it was taken at some stage in the 1980s, and it's more or less just empty hooks, absolutely just purely empty hooks with a little bit of meat in behind and two little old ladies standing at the counter. So it kind of gives you an idea of what communism was like in Poland. And he also takes photographs of everyday life. Absolutely great. Go have a look at the website.
There's a wonderful one that I have in my head of in the snow, and this is from martial law. Martial law's just been declared, and there's sort of armored vehicles on the streets and stuff. And I think it was the Moskva cinema, and it's showing Apocalypse Now, which in Polish was czas apokalipsy. So time of apocalypse, basically. And it's in the snow, and you can see there's sort of armoured vehicles out in the street. And it's just absolutely poetic. The composition of that photo is just amazing. So yeah, really good photographer.
Well, I'm just going to jump in quickly with a couple of female photographers then as well that I think we should just mention. One of them, the Czech-born Jewish photographer Maria Austria, she was known, who was living in Amsterdam, went into hiding in 1941, joined the resistance in 1943. And unlike her parents, her brother and her husband actually survived the war, I'm delighted to say, having documented a lot of the Nazi occupation out in Holland, but also producing fake identity papers as well, photography for fake identity papers. She was actually the woman who took the first photograph of Anne Frank's hiding place after the war, so she's quite well known for that. But there is also a Polish female photographer in the uprising who I think we should remember. Her name was Ewa Fariaszewska, and particularly notable because she was the first person to take colour photographs during the Warsaw Uprising. She took 31, or there are 31 known left that we still have of her colour photographs of that event.
We have. Much as I love Eugeniusz Lokajski, and we're going to have to move away from photography, I'm afraid. I've been looking at a lot at Moscow Kremlin aspect on all of this, and there's quite an interesting development on the 25th of September. So there's a report from Combat Report that goes through Konstantin Rokossovsky, who's the commander of the First Belarusian Front, so it's a very senior Soviet commander, and actually quite sort of realistic and rather sober in that it's an assessment of the failure of the Berling operation, the attempt to cross the Vistula. And they talk about the reasons for the failure of the operation, they say, apart from the enemy's superiority, which obviously is a factor. So they talk about the inability to combat German sort of overwhelming superiority, heavy tanks and armour and so on, that they didn't possess themselves. And that there was no ability to project direct support on the Soviet side across the Vistula, also, very realistic. And even artillery fire from the eastern bank was very, very difficult to direct in the necessary locations. Most tellingly, I think, which is something that it actually backs up something that we've talked about with respect to the Berling army, is that it does state that the soldiers involved were not sufficiently well trained and had no experience of large scale and particularly urban warfare. So again, it points to that aspect of a fundamental lack of experience of Berling's men. So rather, very sober but actually rather objective report on the failings of the Berling army in Warsaw. The last point I want to bring up here is something from Erich von den Bach. We've been using his diary quite a lot in respect to this episode, and it's quite, today is no exception. There's some interesting material there. And the last little quote that I want to read you refers to von den Bach referencing the beginnings of negotiations with the Home Army, negotiations for an eventual surrender of Warsaw. And he says, and I quote, "Today I sent parliamentarians to them." So it really means negotiators. "I sent parliamentarians to them. If everything works out, I will have saved the lives of thousands of women and children again," he says. "Now I know why God has still preserved me. In these terrible times of blood and tears, I must remain humanitarian. Being able to do so much good fills me with deep happiness." Astonishing. Delusions of humanity on behalf of SS General Erich von den Bach, given the slaughter of Warsaw and of Warsaw's civilian and insurgent populations that he had overseen, that he can describe himself in those terms. It's just deluded. It's astonishing. I mean, it's one of those, with these diaries, I think you often, and this is something we have to think about as historians as well, Claire, that when you read a diary account like that, you have to try and work out why the diary is being written in the first place. Now, is it an honest diary for your own consumption, or is it being written for, future, for an audience, for future prosecutors or for future publication? And you have to bear this in mind with, people like Goebbels' diaries, which are a brilliant resource, but there's like 25 volumes of them. It's a fantastic resource for historians, but he is very clearly writing for posterity. He's writing for a future audience about all the grand things that he's doing. That's how he sees it. And I don't know about this one, Erich von der Bach's diary. I don't know it's hard to tell. Is he writing this in a way to sort of provide some sort of reinsurance against a future prosecution so that he can point to his own diary account and say, look how humanitarian I was? I don't know. I mean, it's either that or he's totally deluded.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for day 56. Please stay with us tomorrow for day 57. It's been great. You've managed to hold on for 56 days. We only have less than 10 days to go. So thank you so much for joining us. And also remember, if you liked us, rate us on your favourite listening platform. Thank you so much, everyone.